was standing on my daughter's porch holding a wrapped gift when she stepped outside and pulled the door halfway closed behind her. It was a Saturday morning in October. The air smelled like fallen leaves and the cold that comes just before the season fully turns. I had driven 40 minutes with a box wrapped in blue paper, and a card signed with my grandson Theo's name written in my best handwriting. Nadine looked at me the way you look at someone you have already decided something about. Her arms were crossed before she even started speaking. "Mom," she said, "I need you to hear me clearly. You're not seeing the kids anymore." Just like that. No build-up. No conversation I had missed. No warning call the night before. I heard it clearly. Every word. I also heard from somewhere behind the door, my granddaughter Cora's voice asking, "Is Grandma here?" The door shut. I stood there for a moment holding the blue box. I thought about knocking. I thought about calling through the door. I thought about a dozen things I could have said. Instead, I looked at the closed door and said, "Okay." Then I walked back to my car, put the gift on the passenger seat, and drove home. I didn't cry until I was on the motorway. But I didn't turn back either. The family expected me to fall apart. My sister Pauline called that same evening, clearly already knowing something had happened. She used that careful voice people use when they're waiting for you to break down so they can feel useful. I didn't break down. I told her I was fine. She didn't believe me, but I meant it in a way she couldn't understand yet. I wasn't fine in the sense of feeling good. I was fine in the sense of being clear. Something had settled in me on that drive home. Not acceptance. Clarity. I didn't call Nadine. I didn't send a message. I didn't reach out to my son-in-law Otto asking for an explanation. I went quiet the way you go quiet when you realize that speaking too soon will cost you something you haven't fully understood yet. 3 days later, at 11 in the evening, a message arrived on my phone from Otto. It said, "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the kitchen table and sat with that sentence for a long time. He wasn't asking me to accept something. He was warning me away from something. Those are very different requests. And the fact that he sent it at 11 at night, without Nadine's name attached, told me he knew something she either didn't know he knew or didn't know herself yet. I started paying attention differently from that moment. Nadine has always made her own decisions. That is something I am proud of, even when those decisions have hurt me. She is stubborn the way her father was stubborn, which is to say completely and without apology. When she married Otto 4 years ago, I smiled through the whole day because she was genuinely happy and that was real. What I did not anticipate was his mother, Yvonne. Yvonne arrived in Nadine's life the way certain people arrive. Quietly, helpfully, with casseroles and opinions. She was always pleasant to my face. She called me the other grandma, with a smile that seemed warm until you noticed it never quite reached her eyes. I started asking careful questions over the following week. I spoke to my cousin Brenda, who had attended Nadine and Otto's housewarming the previous year. I spoke to a woman from my church who knew Yvonne's sister. What I learned was consistent. For months, Yvonne had been describing me to people in Nadine's circle as controlling, as unstable, as someone whose love for the grandchildren was intense in an unhealthy way. She had been building a picture of me long before that Saturday morning on the porch. The door being shut in my face was not a beginning. It was the result of something that had already been running quietly for months. I wrote everything I learned in a notebook. Exact words people remembered. I noticed the change in people around the same time I noticed the silence from Nadine. My neighbor Flo, who had known our family for 11 years, stopped waving from her garden when I drove past. At church, a woman named Adiz who usually sat beside me shifted 2 seats away and gave me a polite but closed smile. My sister Pauline called again. This time she didn't bother with the careful voice. She said someone had told her I had been difficult with Nadine and the children, that I showed up unannounced, that I undermined their parenting decisions. I asked her who had told her this. She hesitated. Then she said it had come through Otto's side of the family. I thanked her calmly and ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open and I wrote down a simple observation. When a story about a person spreads to people who have no direct experience with that person, it is not gossip. Gossip is loose and changes shape as it travels. This story was staying consistent. Same phrases, same accusations, same language. Someone was briefing people. Someone had prepared specific words for specific audiences and trusted that those audiences would pass them along without checking. I had been described as toxic. As a grandmother. A woman who drove 40 minutes on a Saturday morning with a wrapped birthday gift. Kept writing in my notebook. Asked for a meeting. I used those exact words in a short message to Nadine. Not a confrontation. Not a conversation about feelings. Meeting. Calm, brief, structured. She agreed, which surprised me. She named a coffee shop in the town center Neutral Ground, which told me she had thought about it or someone had advised her. Otto came too. He sat beside Nadine with his hands wrapped around a mug and spent most of the time looking at the table. At one point he looked at me directly and I saw something in his face that was close to shame but not quite there yet. More like discomfort. The discomfort of a person who has said something they cannot fully take back. I asked a single question. Not about the children. Not about myself. I asked what specifically I had done that made them feel the children were not safe around me. There was a silence. Then Otto said his mother had expressed concern that I was emotionally manipulating the children. That I made them feel guilty for loving both sides of the family equally. That I said things that created divided loyalty. I looked at Nadine when he finished. She did not say it was false. She also did not say it was true. She looked at the table. That silence was the most honest thing she said that entire afternoon. I thanked them for their time. I drove home and added Otto's exact words to my notebook. The meeting had told me one thing clearly. There was a third conversation happening that I was not part of. Something Yvonne had said during that same week surfaced through Brenda, who had heard it from Otto's cousin at a birthday gathering. Yvonne had been talking about estate planning. About protecting the family's financial future. About how it was important to keep outside influences from complicating decisions that should stay within the household. She used the word household to mean her son's household, which she clearly considered an extension of her own. I turned that word over in my mind for a long time. Outside influences. I had known Nadine for her entire life. I had sat with her through her father's illness, through her first heartbreak, through 3 pregnancy scares before Theo was born. I had driven her to hospital appointments and helped her paint the nursery ceiling and held Cora for the first 6 hours of her life while Nadine slept. I was now an outside influence. The estate planning reference was not accidental. People do not bring up wills and assets casually in conversations about family dynamics, unless the two things are connected in their minds. This was not about whether I was a good grandmother. It never had been. It was about who had access to Nadine and what that access might protect or threaten. I wrote the word financial at the top of a new page in my notebook and underlined it. The call came on a Tuesday evening. I didn't recognize the number, which was why I answered. It was Cora. She was 6 years old and she was whispering so quietly I had to press the phone hard against my ear. She said, "Grandma, why are you in trouble?" My chest tightened in a way I was not prepared for. Kept my voice very steady. I told her I was not in trouble. I told her I was perfectly fine and thinking about her every single day. She said, "Daddy said you did something bad." I asked her gently if she knew what the something bad was. She said no. Then she said, "Theo cried at dinner last week. He said he misses you." I heard a sound in the background. An adult voice moving closer. Cora whispered bye. And the call ended. I held my phone for several minutes without moving. There is a particular kind of pain that comes when a child is made to carry a story they don't understand. Cora was 6. She had been told I did something bad. She did not know what it was because there was nothing to know. She was holding confusion shaped like guilt because the adults around her had handed it to her and not explained it. That phone call changed something in my approach. I stopped thinking about my reputation. I started thinking about those 2 children and what the story they were living inside was doing to them quietly, every single day. I went back through everything. Every message thread. Every email. Every written record of any conversation I had ever had with Nadine or Otto about money, property, inheritance, or finances of any kind. Found nothing. 'Cause there was nothing. I had never asked about their accounts. Never offered opinions on their spending. Never requested to be included in any financial decision they made as a couple. The closest I had ever come was offering to pay for Theo's school trip to the Science Museum last spring, which Nadine had accepted gratefully and thanked me for twice. But I had been accused of wanting access to their accounts, of trying to interfere in their financial arrangements. I thought about that carefully. When someone invents a lie, they usually choose something that would be difficult to disprove. Proving that you never said something is harder than proving that you did. Proving you never asked for something leaves no paper trail. The accusation itself becomes the evidence because it triggers a reaction, and the reaction looks like guilt. Yvonne had chosen the accusation well. It was specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be impossible to fully refute. But I also knew something about lies told for a purpose. They are usually told because the truth, if discovered, would be damaging. People do not go to the trouble of building false narratives about other people unless there is something real underneath that the narrative is meant to hide. Kept looking. My cousin Brenda had worked in financial administration for 20 years before she retired. She understood documentation in a way that I found useful when I explained what I was looking for. I was not looking for anything illegal. I was looking for patterns, for timing, for the relationship between things that seemed unconnected on the surface. What I found through careful, patient conversations with people who had no reason to protect Yvonne's interests was this. Approximately 8 months before Nadine shut her door in my face, Yvonne had borrowed a significant amount of money from Nadine and Otto. The figure I heard from 2 separate sources was £30,000. The loan had not been formalized. There was no written agreement. There were messages acknowledging it, but no repayment schedule and no interest discussed. I wrote the figure down. Then I wrote the date I had been cut off. Then I wrote the date of the loan. 8 months apart. I thought about what changes in a person's position when they owe a large sum of money to someone from whom they have borrowed it informally. They become careful. They become compliant. They become motivated to ensure that the person they owe does not feel threatened by outside loyalties. And if someone else, someone independent, someone who loves the borrower and might ask uncomfortable questions, could be removed from the picture first, the arrangement becomes much more secure. I sat with that for a long time before I wrote the next thing in my notebook. The more I understood about the financial arrangement, the more clearly I understood the strategy. Nadine and Otto were not simply under Yvonne's influence. They were under her obligation. £30,000, borrowed without documentation, creates a particular kind of debt. Not just financial. Emotional. The kind where you feel you cannot say no to the person you owe. Where their opinions start carrying the weight of authority because disagreeing with them feels like risking something you cannot afford to lose. Yvonne had positioned herself not just as a mother-in-law but as a creditor. And creditors have power that family members are not supposed to have. Now consider what I represented. I was the one person in Nadine's life who had known her before all of this. Who had no financial stake in her choices. Who would have noticed, eventually, that something was pulling her decisions in directions that didn't serve her. Who might have asked the questions that a daughter in debt to her mother-in-law could not afford to ask. Removing me was not emotional. It was practical. I did not feel angry when I understood this. I felt something closer to sad. Because it meant Nadine had not chosen to cut me off out of genuine conviction. She had been managed into it by a woman who needed the arrangement to stay clean and quiet and unexamined. My daughter was not the villain of this story. She was also, in her own way, a target. I was walking past the side of my house one morning when I heard voices from the open window of the kitchen. I had forgotten I had left it open, and Brenda was inside making tea. She was on the phone. But it wasn't Brenda's voice that stopped me. Through the fence that separated my garden from the neighbors, I heard Yvonne's voice clearly. She was speaking to someone I could not see. She must have been visiting the neighbor, or perhaps just passing. I heard her say, with a particular gentleness of someone performing concern rather than feeling it. If she truly loved Nadine, she would respect her space. A mother who loves her daughter lets her breathe. I stood very still. It was a beautiful sentence. I recognized why it worked. It reframed my presence as a burden and my absence as a gift. It made cutting me off sound like the loving thing to do. It made my love itself the problem. This was not an angry woman. Angry women make mistakes, raise their voices, say things that can be challenged. Yvonne was something more controlled than that. She had learned to weaponize tenderness, to make manipulation sound like wisdom, to make the person being manipulated feel that agreeing with her was their own idea. I went inside and told Brenda what I had heard. She looked at me very steadily and said, "How long has this been going on?" I told her I was still finding out. The ultimatum reached me the way most things did in those weeks, through someone who had been told something by someone who had been told something else. My sister Pauline, who had slowly been coming back to my side as the story became less clear-cut than she had initially been told, rang me on a Thursday afternoon. She had spoken to a cousin of Otto's named Dara, who had been present at a family dinner 6 weeks before the porch incident. At that dinner, Yvonne had told Otto privately, though Dara was nearby and heard, that he needed to make a choice. Not in those words. Yvonne never said things in direct words. But the message was clear. Either I remained in Nadine's life with full access and closeness, or Yvonne would step back from her own involvement. And her involvement, as both Otto and Nadine knew, came with the loan, the shared investments, the financial arrangement that had no written exit. It was not a request. It was a loyalty test with economic consequences attached. Otto had chosen his mother's version of the story, not because he was a cruel man. Because he was a frightened one. He was afraid of what stepping away from his mother's approval might cost him in ways that went beyond feelings. I added Dara's name to my notebook. Then I wrote underneath it, "They did not choose against me. They chose toward their fear." That distinction mattered to me. I was not sure why yet, but it mattered. 8 weeks after the porch. That was how long I stayed completely silent. No calls. No messages, no cards sent through the post, no appearances at school gates or birthday gatherings, no requests passed through relatives, nothing. People expected me to break. Pauline checked in regularly with a combination of concern and curiosity that she could not quite hide. A woman from my church asked if I had considered a solicitor about grandparent visitation rights. Even Brenda suggested gently that I might want to at least send a card to Cora on her upcoming half-term. I said no to all of it. Not because I didn't miss the children. I missed them in a way that sat in my chest like a stone that never moved, every single day. But I understood something that the people advising me did not fully understand yet. Pressure from me would give Yvonne's story oxygen. Every message I sent, every request I made, every tear reported back through the family network would be used to confirm the narrative. She causes problems. She cannot let go. She is unstable. My silence was not defeat. My silence was strategy. And here was what I had noticed about strategies built on false foundations. They require maintenance. They require the original problem, the person being managed, to keep reacting in ways that justify the management. When I stopped reacting entirely, the strategy had nothing to maintain itself on. I learned later what happened inside that house during those 8 weeks. I learned it in pieces, from Otto himself, from Nadine, and from small things Theo said months afterward without understanding their significance. Without me as the named problem, the household lost its organizing complaint. Yvonne had structured a great deal of the family's emotional conversation around managing my influence. When there was no influence to manage, the conversations had to find somewhere else to go. They went inward. Otto and Nadine began arguing about the loan. Not openly at first, but questions started surfacing. When would it be repaid? What were the terms? Why had they agreed to something so large with nothing written down? Nadine started asking why certain financial decisions seemed to require Yvonne's approval before they could be finalized. Otto did not have good answers because he had not asked these questions before. He had been too close to the arrangement to see its shape clearly. I was not there for any of this. But I understood it when I heard about it later because it was exactly what I had expected. Control structures do not collapse because someone exposes them from outside. They collapse because the people inside them start asking the questions they were always too comfortable or too afraid to ask. My absence had created the space for those questions. Her name was Comfort. She was 63 years old, and she had been a close family friend of Otto's family for nearly 2 decades. She called me out of the blue on a Wednesday morning in November and said she had something she needed to tell me in person. We met at a garden center cafe near her home. She arrived before me, which I noticed. She had chosen a corner table and sat with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door, which told me she was nervous about being seen. She told me that before me, there had been another woman pushed out of that family circle. Otto's aunt, his father's sister, a woman named Bernice. Bernice had been close to Otto's father before he passed. After the funeral, Yvonne had slowly but systematically created distance between Bernice and the rest of the family. Within 18 months, Bernice was not attending family events. Within 2 years, she had been described to younger members of the family as someone who had caused problems during a difficult time. Bernice had also, Comfort told me quietly, challenged Yvonne about the handling of the estate after Otto's father died. She had been right to challenge it. But she had been made irrelevant before anyone was willing to listen. I was not the first. And Yvonne had clearly learned from what worked before. Brenda was the one who found it. She knew what to look for and she was patient in a way that I admired deeply. It took her 3 weeks of careful research through records that were technically public. Company filings, property registration changes, financial disclosures attached to a small business that Yvonne and her son had jointly operated before Otto married Nadine. What she found was this. Assets that had been registered in Otto's name before his father's death had been quietly transferred, across a period of 14 months following the funeral, into accounts and registrations that Yvonne controlled. The transfers were legal. Everything had been done through proper channels. But the cumulative effect was that Otto, who should have inherited a significant share of his father's estate, had substantially less than what the original will had suggested he would receive. Yvonne had not stolen from her son, but she had managed his inheritance in a way that left her in control of most of it. And Otto did not know. Or he half knew and had filed it in the part of his mind where uncomfortable truths go when you are not ready to examine them. I looked at what Brenda had put in front of me for a long time. Then I thought about Nadine. About my daughter, who had borrowed £30,000 from this woman and had no written agreement for its return. My daughter was not just isolated. She was financially exposed. It reached me through Pauline, who had heard it from her daughter, who was friendly with one of the teachers at Theo's school. Theo had told his teacher during a quiet activity period that he missed his grandma but that his daddy said she caused problems. He had said it simply, in the way children say things that they are carrying without knowing the weight of them. The teacher had noted it. She had spoken gently to Theo and reported the comment through the appropriate school channel as a routine welfare note. But it had traveled the way things do in small communities where people know each other across different parts of life. Pauline told me about it on a Sunday afternoon. She sat across from me in my kitchen and watched my face carefully as she spoke. I think she expected me to be upset. Instead, I was quiet for a moment and then I said, "Good." She looked at me strangely. I explained. As long as the story only lived inside Yvonne's controlled circle, it could be managed. But a 7-year-old boy telling his teacher that his grandma causes problems was not a manageable moment. It was the kind of thing that gets noticed by people outside the arrangement. It was a crack in the surface. And cracks, once they start, do not usually stop at the edges of where they begin. The story was becoming visible in ways Yvonne could not script. Nadine called on a Saturday morning, exactly 10 weeks after the porch. I recognized her number and let the phone ring twice before I answered, not to punish her, but because I needed those 2 rings to settle myself. She said she just wanted to talk. Her voice was different, not softer exactly, more uncertain. There is a difference between someone who is uncertain because they are weak and someone who is uncertain because they have started questioning something solid they previously believed. Nadine sounded like the second kind. We talked for 40 minutes. She did not apologize. She was not there yet. But she told me that she had found some inconsistencies in their financial records. That certain transactions she had not been fully aware of were becoming clearer to her as she looked more carefully. That she had some questions she didn't know how to ask. She did not name Yvonne. But she didn't have to. The fact that she was calling me at all was its own answer. The woman who had been positioned as an outside influence, as a danger, as someone to be kept away from the household. Her daughter was calling her on a Saturday morning because something inside the household had shifted enough that the narrative no longer held the same weight it had before. I listened more than I spoke. At the end of the call, she said, "I've missed you, Mum." I said, "I know, love. I've missed you too." Nadine did not tell me about the confrontation directly. I heard the outline of it from her later, in fragments, across several conversations over the following weeks. But I understood enough to piece together what had happened. She had sat down with Yvonne alone, without Otto in the room. She had asked specific questions about the loan, about the repayment timeline, about certain financial decisions that had been made in the previous year that Nadine had later realized she had not fully understood when she agreed to them. Yvonne had responded the way she always responded. Warmly, gently, with a particular sadness of someone who feels misunderstood after everything they have given. But Nadine had come with questions written down. She had prepared. She had not come to have a feeling. She had come for answers. When the warmth and the gentle sadness did not produce answers, Yvonne shifted. She became defensive. She said she had only ever tried to help. She said that some people, naming no one but looking in a direction, had clearly been putting ideas in Nadine's head. She said she had sacrificed a great deal for this family. Nadine told me later that the moment Yvonne mentioned sacrifice, something clicked for her. Because a person who is genuinely generous does not track what they have given. A person who is building leverage does. The mask had slipped. Nadine had seen it clearly. The gathering happened because Otto called it. That surprised everyone, including me. He had gathered his and Nadine's closest family. His sister, his uncle, Pauline on my behalf, and two of Nadine's friends who had been part of the circle where the original story about me had spread. He sat at the head of his dining room table and he spoke without a prepared speech. He laid things out one at a time. Alone. The absence of documentation. The asset transfers Brenda had identified through public records, which Otto had now independently confirmed with his own bank. The inheritance discrepancy. The pattern of isolation going back to what had been done to his Aunt Bernice after his father's funeral. He was not shouting. He was not emotional in a chaotic way. He was methodical and clear, the way a person is when they have finally decided to stop managing their own discomfort and simply tell the truth. Yvonne was not present. She had not been invited. When Otto finished, the room was quiet. Then his sister said, "I wondered when someone would finally say it out loud." That sentence told me that the people closest to the arrangement had seen more than they had admitted. They had been waiting for someone with enough courage to name it first. The control strategy did not collapse loudly. It simply stopped being the thing everyone agreed to pretend they could not see. Otto came to see me alone on a Tuesday evening. He knocked on my front door and stood on my porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, which reminded me uncomfortably of the morning Nadine had stood on her own porch and shut the door in my face. I invited him in. Made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. He said he was sorry. He said it simply, without excessive explanation. Then he said something I did not expect. He said he had not understood until recently how long his mother had been managing him. Not just in relation to me. In relation to his father's estate, his finances. His sense of what he was entitled to question and what he should leave alone. He said he had been raised to believe that his mother's emotional distress was a signal that he had done something wrong. That her disappointment was evidence of his failure. That keeping her comfortable was the same as being a good son. He said he was only now beginning to understand that those things were not the same. I looked at him across my kitchen table, and I felt something I had not expected to feel toward him in those weeks. Sympathy. Genuine and uncomplicated. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had been shaped by the same person now shaping my daughter, and he had believed the shaping was love because he had never known anything different. I told him I appreciated him coming. Meant it. The gathering had consequences that moved outward in circles. The family members who had been told I was controlling and unstable had now sat in a room and heard Otto, calmly and specifically, describe what had actually been happening. They had heard about the loan, the documentation, the inheritance. They had heard the pattern named clearly by the person who had been closest to it. People who had avoided me at church or shifted seats or repeated the story about toxic grandmothers had to do something with the information. Some of them reached out to me directly. Adiz, the woman who had moved 2 seats away, stopped me after a service and said quietly that she was glad I was well. Yvonne, meanwhile, had attempted her usual approach. She had called Otto's sister to explain. She had sent messages to relatives suggesting the gathering had been driven by outside influence. She had framed herself in the way she always did, as a woman who had only ever loved her family and was now being punished for it. But the story no longer had the same surface to stick to. The people she was speaking to had already heard the other account. They had heard it from Otto. They were now holding both versions and comparing them and finding that one had documents attached and one had feelings attached. Feelings without documents are easy to manufacture. That was the thing Yvonne had counted on and the thing that had finally stopped working. She came on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the gathering. I heard the car in the driveway and looked through the front window before opening the door. She was alone. No Otto. No children in the back seat. I opened the door before she knocked. She stood on my porch, and I noticed this. I could not help but notice it, holding nothing. No gift. No casserole. Just herself in a coat she had pulled tight, with her eyes red around the edges in a way that told me she had been crying before she arrived. She said, "I chose the wrong voice, Mum. I chose the wrong voice and I let it tell me things about you that weren't true, and I am so deeply sorry." I looked at her for a long moment. My daughter, 41 years old and standing on my porch the way she used to stand at my bedroom door at 8 years old when she had done something she knew was wrong. I did not immediately say it was all right. 'Cause it was not all right. Not yet. The children had spent weeks being told their grandma did something bad. Cora had called me in a whisper from a hidden tablet. Theo had cried at dinner and told his teacher he missed me. I stepped aside and let her in. Put the kettle on. I sat across from her at my kitchen table and I said, "Tell me everything." We talked for 3 hours. Reconciliation was not a door swinging open. It was a gate and I controlled the lock. I told Nadine in the days that followed that I was willing to rebuild what we had. But I needed certain things to be different, and I needed them in words we both understood and agreed to, not feelings that would fade the next time someone applied pressure. I needed transparency. Not about everything, but about the financial arrangements that had been used to create leverage over her household. I needed her and Otto to formalize the loan agreement with Yvonne, in writing with a repayment schedule. Not because I expected to be involved, but because a documented agreement is harder to weaponize than an informal one. I needed to be consulted as a grandmother, not tolerated as one. My relationship with Theo and Cora was not a gift given at someone else's discretion. It was part of who they were and who I was. And I told her clearly that if I ever found myself being managed out of their lives again through stories told behind my back, I would not go quietly a second time. Not because I would fight loudly, but because I now understood exactly how the strategy worked and I knew precisely how to dismantle it. Nadine listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she nodded and said, "That's fair." It was the most adult conversation we had ever had. I was proud of both of us. 4 months later, on a Friday evening in February, I sat in a school hall that smelled like floor polish and packed lunches and children's excitement. Theo was in the school play. He had a speaking part. 3 lines about a lost star finding its way home, which I thought was almost too perfect given everything that had happened. He had insisted I sit in the front section. He had told his teacher his grandma was coming and could she please save a seat. The seat had been saved. Nadine sat beside me. She had squeezed my hand when I arrived. Otto sat on her other side, and he had nodded at me in a way that carried more apology than words could have held. Cora sat on my lap for the first 20 minutes, which is not technically allowed at school events, but nobody said anything. She smelled like the same shampoo she had always used, and she leaned her head back against my collarbone and watched her brother on stage with enormous serious eyes. 3 rows behind us, I was told later by Pauline who had spotted her. Yvonne sat alone, silent, watching a family that no longer required her management in order to function. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me worth turning around for. I had not fought for my place in their lives. I had done something harder than fighting. I had waited with my eyes open until the truth arrived on its own schedule. It always does.